Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to see you, and thank you so much for being with us today. Welcome to America at a Crossroads, our 107th consecutive week of programming. I'm Janice Kaminer-Resnick. Welcome from Jews United for Democracy and Justice and from community advocates and from our leadership team, former Congressman Mel Levine, Zev Yaroslavsky, Rabbi Ken Chazin, Caroline Kelly, David Lehr, and myself. We are very pleased tonight to welcome the extraordinarily brilliant and prolific Jennifer Rubin in conversation with our great friend, Madeleine Brand. This week, Jews celebrate Shavuot, the holiday celebrating the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai. There was a recognition from the outset that without a code of laws, there can be no justice, civility, or peace. And as became evident both in the development of Jewish law and American law, the law was inherently a living organism which slowly was modeled and adapted as society changed and progressed. We see that in Jewish law in the tomes of Talmud and in American law as a core principle in the way our legislative and judicial branches of government are intended to operate. This notion of law and justice is highly relevant to the mission of this town hall series and most notably to the topics to be covered tonight. The likely impending revocation of the half-century-old law of the land related to abortion rights is especially jarring. I look forward to hearing from our speaker tonight about the likely scenario in our country as we look to that 50-year-old legal right being extinguished. Another topic tonight relates to gun violence. And on this topic, I look forward to hearing from our speaker what she believes will happen if we do not, as a country, find a way to pass laws aimed at limiting gun violence. In both cases, there are vast majorities of Americans who want laws different than what our legislative and judicial branches are providing. So my question for Jennifer and Madeleine on this pre-Shavuot America at a Crossroads program is this. It's actually two questions. How do we shape a just civil society when there are such huge schisms amongst those governed, and when there is a huge schism between those making the laws and those who are supposed to be governed by those laws? So I'll look forward to hearing our discussion on those topics tonight. Next week, we will focus on inflation, the economy, and its likely impact on the 2022 elections with Pulitzer Prize winning New York Times journalist David Leonhardt, who has covered the economy for the New York Times for more than a decade. The week after, we welcome back Ron Brownstein, one of the nation's leading polling experts. He is a columnist at The Atlantic and a senior political analyst on CNN. In the wake of major primaries over this past week and the next few weeks, and the breakneck speed of political events, his analysis is always timely. Now, my partner, David Lehr, will tell you about a few more of our upcoming programs, and Chag Sameach to all those who celebrate Shavuot.
Thank you, Janice, for those words of wisdom and those challenging questions. I think Jennifer and Madeleine will have their hands full. I, too, am pleased to welcome you all back to America at a Crossroads. Tonight, we're hosting, as Janice mentioned, the guest who joined us on our very first virtual program in April 2020, Jennifer Rubin. As you may have noticed on the upcoming event screen a few moments ago before Janice spoke, we have an impressive series of programs upcoming. From the economy and its challenges to the midterm elections to a deep dive on Russia, Putin, and the Russo-Ukraine war. On the subject of Russia, we start with an evening with the New York Times' Peter Baker and the New Yorker's Susan Glasser, both of whom covered Putin and Russia for 4 years while living in Moscow. Then we will hear from Bill Browder, a fascinating man who once was Russia's largest foreign investor, a committed capitalist with an MBA from Stanford, and also the grandson of a man who once headed the Communist Party USA. Browder became a target of Putin's ire for not acquiescing to extortion. He will talk about his firsthand experience with murder, money laundering, and how to deal with a kleptocracy. Finally, we'll get a diplomatic take on the implications of Ukraine, Russia from Ambassador Dennis Ross, whom we had rescheduled earlier in the spring. He was head of the State Department's policy planning staff, its think tank, when the Soviet Union fell several decades ago. He knows from whence he speaks. And of course, we'll have a return next month from the New York Times columnist and all-around maven, David Brooks, will be with us, as I mentioned. And tonight's guest, Jennifer Rubin, has been on America at a Crossroads several times, in no small measure because of the prodigious output of several columns each week in the Washington Post, but also because of the range of topics that she covers. It is truly impressive. Jennifer is also an MSNBC contributor and recently authored Resistance, How Women Save Democracy. It's a fascinating read. To moderate tonight's program and introduce moderate tonight's program is a good friend and one of our most frequent hosts, KCRW's Madeleine Brand. She's the host of Press Play, a daily program of news and culture, and she also hosts the Legal Eagle Files on KCRW. She's reported for NPR nationally and locally for over 30 years. Madeleine?
Thank you, David. Thank you, Janice. It's great to be back. Thank you for having me back, and great to see you too, Jennifer. Jennifer, for people who don't remember, did a short stint at KCRW a few years ago, pre-COVID. So it's nice to see you again outside the basement. Before we get into the news of the day, I kind of want to pull the curtain back a little bit and get you to talk about your process, because as David mentioned, you are a prodigious columnist. Sometimes you write 2 a day, I believe. What is your process? How do you do what you do? How are you so prolific?
Well, as I like to joke, it's cheaper than therapy. And I do love to write. In general, what I do is read and talk to people a lot. And sometimes people raise issues that I'm unaware of and that may not be on the front pages of the newspaper. And sometimes they have a take on ongoing issues. As you mentioned, I have a broad range of issues that I look at. So on any given day, I'm not quite sure what's going to come over the transom. And very often my attention is directed by events that are happening that day or general themes that I have pursued over the last few years. One of those themes being the fate of democracy, another being the state of the Supreme Court and confidence in the rule of law, and another being America's place in the world and our leadership based on national values. So I am attracted to those subjects, so I look for new and interesting information, but I never know when good ideas are going to present themselves or interesting new issues. And, I have been known to be reading a novel and suddenly something clicks and I get a bug to write about something. So really inspiration comes from a lot of different places.
Wow. Do you ever feel like, I don't want to have an opinion on everything? Like, can I take a break?
I have a lot of freedom, so I don't have to write on everything. And I'll give you an example. I have zero interest in the Johnny Depp trial. I made a point not to watch it, not to care about it. I couldn't think of any reason why a mature country should be really fascinated by these two obviously disturbed people. And so I choose just not to write about it or to form an opinion about who I think was liable for what. So it is a little bit of I guess a guilty pleasure that I don't have to write on everything. I will say at times, though, the inability to turn off literally the mayhem and to escape from really what is increasingly a disturbing, chaotic world does take a toll. And when that happens, I go on vacation, which I just did, and I'm back now, refreshed and ready to go.
Good. And what about social media? Because you are forceful in your opinions, and to be a good columnist, you have to be. But you must get tons of blowback on social media. Do you ignore it, or do you engage with it? How do you handle it?
I largely ignore it, and that's not because I don't like and don't respond to criticism well. It's really a function of time. As you know, social media is just a all-encompassing time suck, if you will excuse the expression. And I have, last time I looked, 600,000 plus Twitter followers. So if I took the chance and took the opportunity to read all the responses and interact with everyone, I would get nothing else done. But I will say, if readers write a thoughtful, succinct email that raises interesting points, and particularly if they disagree, I will read it and I will think about it. And if possible, I'll respond. So it's a balance that I think every journalist has to maintain between keeping their sanity, keeping their focus, and making sure that readers are following along. One thing that I have started doing, I now have a Friday chat with readers, and I enjoy that tremendously. Readers have a chance to send in questions that are really sometimes just brilliant and clever and somewhat, I think, deep in a very fundamental sense. Sometimes about my Judaism, how it affects my writing, sometimes simply about my thoughts on the events of the day. And that's a really good way for me to have a sense of what readers are thinking and what their opinions are.
Now, you have said and written that we need to have a different way of approaching the news now, not just as consumers, but as journalists and as leaders in this country, given what's happening in this country, how polarized it is, and what's happening with our democracy. And you used to be a lawyer, now you're a columnist. So I think there's probably some similar skills there in terms of rhetoric and the effective use of it. But what do you think journalism is doing or not doing, more to the point, that it should be doing? And how should journalists change the way that they approach the news, given what's at stake these days?
I think what has happened in the country has been a departure from everything we assumed and really hoped for in politics. And that was essentially a competition between two national parties that operated more or less in the realm of facts. Obviously, politicians will spin and exaggerate. But both parties, whether it was Republican Party in power, Democratic Party in power, Republican president, Democratic president, that their aim was, as they saw fit, to improve the lives of Americans and protect national interests. That has not been the case since really the end of the Obama administration. And what we now have is one normal political party, the Democrats, with whom I certainly have disagreements, but another that has morphed into this kind of cult-like organization that does not feel bound by facts, does not feel bound by political norms, engages in performative politics, and really is not playing, if you will, the same game that everyone else is. And I think the press has largely had great difficulty in recognizing that and adapting to that. They naturally do not want to be seen as taking sides, Democrat or Republican. Many in the mainstream media have been beaten up for years about a so-called liberal bias, so they're particularly sensitive to criticism from the right. And so the way they approach the current politics is the mode that they used to approach politics all the time, which was Democrats say this, Republicans say that. The president says X, the experts say that. And that sort of reserved, dispassionate balance was basically a legitimate way of informing the public to make their own choices. Unfortunately, when one party is not making a good faith effort to engage with reality, when one party has determined that the democratic process itself is fodder for gaining power, then that method of journalism really does a disservice. And the way I like to describe it to people is, if Democrats say it's raining outside and Republicans say it's sunny, the job of the journalist is not to say Republicans say X, Democrats say Y. It's to open the window and look outside and tell people as best as they are able what the facts are, what reality informs us. Now, sometimes facts are unclear. Sometimes the differences between the party truly are of opinions, but we needn't pretend, and I think it really is a pretension at this point, that when Republicans say something, that that is a good faith answer. When they make statements to the effect that, that hammers, kill more people than guns, when they make allegations that the 2020 election was stolen, when they make all kinds of kind of ridiculous remarks, it behooves journalists, those on the news side, to say, although the Republicans are saying X, this is demonstrably untrue, and here's why. And I think there is nothing wrong with, and in fact, it's a necessity for democratic survival, for journalists to take a position in favor of the truth. What side they should be on? They should be on the side of truth. And if one party has consistently decided not to be on the side of truth, well, that's the way the cookie is going to crumble, and they are going to be in for more criticism and more exacting coverage than perhaps they like. That's not the fault of journalists. That's the fault of people who have decided that objective reality doesn't serve their interests.
No.
So I think I would like to see much more candor and willingness by journalists to call out what they know to be true, and to remind their readers, their viewers, of what the Republican Party is up to. I'll give two examples where I think this would be extremely helpful. Journalists talk a lot about, quote, polarization, as if this thing descended on the American scene, and Republicans and Democrats are equally extreme, equally divided, and have left the center of the political spectrum for good. And in fact, that's just demonstrably not true. Democrats over the last decade or so have become somewhat more progressive, but Republicans have gone around the bend and completely abandoned not only what they used to believe in, but the very notion of compromise and political problem solving. So it's not polarization that's the problem, it's radicalization. And I really would hope that journalists would start making that clear. Likewise, when we talk about assaults on democracy, bills to make it harder to vote, you would think that this was some kind of bipartisan exercise, and Democrats were scheming to make sure Republicans didn't vote, and Republicans were scheming to make sure Democrats didn't vote. That's not the case. I am unaware of a single Democratic effort to disenfranchise voters, to empower partisan legislators to decide election outcomes rather than impartial election officials. So when we talk about attacks on democracy, it behooves us to say Republican attacks on democracy. It behooves us to say Republican attempts to subvert and suppress voting. And I think the more we, I think, slip into the danger zone of ongoing efforts to undermine democracy, the more critical it becomes for reporters to be candid about this.
Yeah, I think that in general, reporters do point out when people are espousing the lies of the 2020 election, that it was stolen and all that, and they do note that it is Republicans doing that. But perhaps they're not doing it in such clear and stark, unmissable terms as you would like them to do. The other thing, though, I think that weighs in the backs of minds of journalists, including myself, is that this seems to be something that is straight out of what Steve Bannon and lots of far-right extremists want, and that is to turn the media into the enemy, and which Trump was very, very good at doing. And that when this happens, you have that in the back of your mind, that you do not want to be viewed as part of the enemy, quote unquote. when you're doing your reporting. And I'm wondering if you ever think that too, if when you were doing reporting on, January 6th, the insurrection, everything
Right.
around the 2020 election, if you think about that too, and how what you're saying is being used by these extremists.
Well, I think again, if we wonder about how people operating in bad faith are going to characterize what we do, we'll be paralyzed. We'll give them a veto over candor and over truth. So I think the way journalists establish, or in some cases reestablish, credibility is by tough reporting, by granular evidence, by admitting error when we make error, and by making sure that not that we treat politicians equally, but that we are equally concerned about violations of democratic values when they present themselves. And sometimes that comes from a candidate who is loath to admit defeat. And I would say that quite candidly about the Georgia loser, Stacey Abrams, in 2018. But more often than not, it is Republicans these days. So I do think that the concern about sort of staying out of the line of fire really is an impossible exercise, because this is what authoritarian movements and leaders do. They categorize, demonize free journalism and really all independent sources of fact, be it scientists, be it journalists, be it universities, researchers, medical professionals. And you really cannot be constrained by fear that they will retaliate or use you to whip up their troops. I think you have to do your job. You have to put it out there. And you have to remember that to some extent, you are not really reaching a good deal of the American public. And this is a real concern, that there are millions of Americans who do not have access to or cut themselves off from reliable, good journalistic material, that they live in a world of make-believe that is constructed by propagandistic media. And so I unfortunately have a limited opportunity to reach those people because they choose not to read. They choose to bury themselves in a media asylum. So my job
I guess
is,
what is our responsibility to reach out to them? I guess.
yes.
We can't give up on them.
I certainly would love to have viewers of all types. I can't help that they refuse to read the Washington Post, or that they won't read, an accurate report by the Justice Department and choose to believe some kind of conspiracy theory, for example, about Special Prosecutor John Durham. So absolutely, I would love for those people to begin accessing good, responsible journalism. And frankly, not me. Just read the news side of the Washington Post. Just read the news side of the Wall Street Journal. Many good publications. So you can only, you can't force people to consume reliable, credible journalism. What you can do, I think, is reach out to people whose minds are not made up, who are in good faith trying to figure this out, and also to people who have kind of checked out of the political process, have thrown their hands up and said, they're all terrible. I can't deal with this. It's too upsetting to follow the news. Elections don't matter. And I think a large part of what I've tried to do since 2015, when Donald Trump came onto the scene, was, and what I did in my book, is to impress upon media consumers and all voters that this is a participatory exercise, that democracy is all of us, that they can't just check out, that if they want to live in a decent, fair, safe society. They don't have the luxury of, playing video games all day long or refusing to inform themselves. So I think a lot of what journalists need to do is to remember the very large percentage, disturbingly large percentage of Americans who don't even vote or who are not registered, and to really explain what their stake in democracy is, to explain what's at issue here. Frankly, the Republicans have made it somewhat easier to explain because the kind of radical changes to our political environment are happening from all directions nonstop. But I do make a particular effort to try to engage readers on the basis of their responsibilities, their participation, and particularly for younger voters who sometimes don't see a need to really get involved in the political process. And I think that's a major responsibility of the news media, to explain the political world and to engage with voters so that they feel like this democracy is their responsibility as well.
Well, I think a lot of them look at who's leading the country and they think, well, they're not talking to me. They're, 100 years old and they're talking in Washington ease and they're not speaking to my issues. And with the exception of someone like Bernie Sanders. But when they look at Joe Biden, they think, I don't know how he represents me on either side. And when you look at the larger poll numbers, of course, we all know he's underwater. What is your sense as to why he is so unpopular now, and how much of that is his own doing?
Well, I think the reality is that all presidents these days face a challenge. I doubt in my lifetime you're ever going to see a president with a sustained approval rating of over 50%. And the reason is that, what was the number? Now I forget, 74 million people voted for Donald Trump knowing he was Donald Trump, and are simply not prepared to accept any good news, any good thing that the president does. And you'll see this polling, which is quite remarkable when Republicans are asked, are you favoring doing this on Ukraine? Yes. Favor of doing this on Ukraine? Yes. And all these things are things that President Biden is doing. And then they're asked, do you approve of President Biden's handling of the war in Ukraine? And they say, absolutely not. No. So they start, it's not just Biden. Every president, I think, now starts off with a very low ceiling on approval ratings. President Biden, I think, is suffering from several problems. The first is quite simply inflation. There is nothing more corrosive of people's sense of security, of their optimism, than inflation. And it's not unlike, frankly, the Jimmy Carter years, where people simply felt that they were going backwards, not forwards, that they could purchase less and less each week. And so long as we have inflation that affects really voters across the board, the president's going to be held responsible for that. Now, you can make all the arguments in the world, and I wrote a piece about that today, that it's really the Federal Reserve's problem, that this is an international problem, that this was aggravated by the Ukraine war. People don't want to hear it. They hold the president responsible. And so the president has to appear engaged. And more importantly, the president has to deliver results. And inflation is not coming down immediately. And it may not come down for months and months. So Biden, I think, suffers from that. I think there are also aspects of his presidency that make it harder, frankly, for people to engage and support him. He has an approach to politics that, for better or worse, is a very insider perspective. He sometimes refers to himself, or others refer to him as the 51st senator. So it's the kind of backslapping kind of Senate-ese with a real emphasis on granular process, granular provisions, promoting a package of Build Back Better that was so enormous that it was incapable of explanation to the average person to know what was even in it. And so I think it kind of just sinks into a mush for many people. And what I have recommended, other people have recommended, is that he do fewer things, he be punchier in his delivery, and he begin to make some sharp distinctions between what he is at least trying to accomplish and what the alternative is. And I think that's just not his nature. When he talks about Mitch McConnell being rational on guns, when he talks about the fact that, yes, he believes that we can still get things done, he's inhabiting a world, a political universe that frankly probably doesn't exist anymore. And it makes it difficult for people to see clarity and conviction and progress in ways that they would like. I have a piece for tomorrow, which I'll preview for all of you tuned in, which looks at two Democratic Senate candidates, Tim Ryan of Ohio and John Fetterman in Pennsylvania. And they have different political views than one another. They're in states of different political complexions, Ohio much more red, Pennsylvania is still somewhat blue. But they share a style of politics that I think is very effective, that's aimed at ordinary people. They talk in blunt, clear language. They don't necessarily wear suits and try to impress people with their erudite understanding of, Senate process. It's a very direct, very down to earth, if you will, economic populist appeal that I think is going to ignore to their benefit. There's a poll out today that although Ohio is, as I said, very Republican, that Senate race is now essentially statistically tied. So Ryan is getting through to people. He campaigns in work boots and jeans and talks about building things in Ohio. He doesn't talk down to voters, but he does talk to what they're concerned about. And I think Fetterman does the same thing. He goes to the redder parts of Pennsylvania, talks to people who are not necessarily college educated, who do feel left out, and he speaks very directly, and he relates to them in a way that they feel like he is speaking to them, to their interests. Yeah. And I think it is a matter of candidate, and it is a matter of candidate style, and Democrats would be wise to watch what those two are up to. I think they're very effective.
The irony, I guess, if you want to call it that, is that Biden used to be that person, the guy from Scranton you'd want to have a beer with, right? And now,
yes, he was. And remember Scranton Joe from Scranton, and certainly he played that role, if you remember, in the Obama administration as vice president. Obama
people
was
loved him. They loved his smizing and all that stuff.
Right. Yeah. He spoke his mind. He was much more direct. He spoke to blue collar workers. And I think he's lost some of that. And I think, part of it is the overwhelming demands of the presidency. A great deal of his time has to be directed towards things like the war in Ukraine that many voters don't care about. I think part of it is that we live in, even compared to 2008, 2012, a different political environment. And I think part of it is also the sort of intense frenzied coverage that now accompanies politics. You talk about social media. I think that constant barrage of criticism, of pseudo scandal, of just sort of political noise is very hard for politicians to deal with. And it's very easy for them to get knocked off track. It's very easy for them to become defensive and kind of prickly. And you see some of that from this White House now, where just the other day, a report from NBC News that they're very upset that they're not getting credit for all the good things they've done. Welcome to the White House. That goes with the territory.
Yeah. So, okay. So let's, speaking of, let's just switch a little bit, hot button issues that could or could not animate voters. Let's talk about abortion. Any day now or any week now, we'll get the Roe decision. And by all accounts, Roe will fall. So we could talk about this for the rest of the hour, but I guess just since we're talking about politics, let's talk about it in that frame. Do you think this will be an animating issue for the midterms in which the Democrats are expected to be shellacked?
I think it will. I know it's very popular to think, oh, none of these things matter. Both sides get kind of ginned up about it. But I think what we've seen, even by the leak, the possibility, a strong possibility, that the constitutional landscape will change radically, is a very strong, very engaged reaction from Democrats. And you see a lot of Republicans who don't want to talk about it. And there's a reason they don't want to talk about it. And that is that criminalizing abortion is very unpopular. If you look at polling, Roe and its progeny are more popular than ever. You have over 60% of Americans who think Roe v. Wade should not be overturned. You have,
but only a third of Republicans.
Correct. So I think the issue comes home, as it does in all these issues, in places where the outcome is not preordained. It's not going to make a difference in a gubernatorial election in Mississippi, but it could very well play a role in Ohio, in Pennsylvania, as voters become concerned, and suburban professional women in particular, but all women, that suddenly the legal landscape has turned hostile, that their lives are going to be thrown up into chaos, and that frankly, it represents a level of disrespect and a level of attack on their personal autonomy that they never imagined would be the case in their lifetime. So I actually think the reaction is not going to be balanced. The question is how willing Democrats are to sharpen that message and to pursue it. A reporter in the White House briefing today, I don't recall who it was, asked a great question, which is, why hasn't Biden talked about it since the leak? The press secretary gave a very political answer, but in fact, Biden hates this issue. He doesn't like to talk about abortion. He is a devout Catholic, and he's never felt comfortable talking about that issue. If Democrats want to energize their base, and this is about energizing their base, and they do want to reach those suburban voters, particularly suburban women, it will behoove them to talk about this and talk about it in ways that really explain how extreme and how radical the Republican conception, pardon the phrase, really is, that they're talking about criminalizing abortion from the moment of conception, and in many cases, without an exception for the health or even the life of the mother. This is a radical position. So I think it is going to have an impact. With all the caveats, we don't know what the final opinion is going to be. We don't know exactly how it's going to interact with state laws. But I think we can assume it's not going to be good news for the pro-choice movement. And I think it will be up to them to explain to voters not only why this is a problem, but really the danger of a Supreme Court that has decided that it's not going to pay attention to precedent, even 50-year-old precedent, and that this may just be the beginning of a radical reactionary movement. And I do think the sense that the Supreme Court is very out of touch with the values and the concerns of ordinary Americans is going to increase. And it's not going to simply be from abortion. We're going to see it on guns. I suspect we're going to see it in a whole realm of decisions. And I think that is a fairly potent issue for Democrats.
Right. But if the Congress goes Republican, there is the possibility, I don't want to say likelihood, that there will be a national bill introduced that would criminalize abortion in all 50 states.
Well, I think we can be assured that the president would veto such a bill. And I think judging from the squeamishness that Republicans are suddenly showing towards the issue, they may have trouble getting the necessary votes. But I think that possibility is precisely—
if the next president is Trump, then—
Correct. And I think that reality is something that Democrats have to explain. I think that's exactly right. I think Democrats are often in love with their own policies and unwilling to characterize even accurately their opponents. And I think the time has come for them to begin to talk about their values and the values that they think are being put at risk by a very radicalized Republican Party.
Okay, let's turn to Ukraine. And George Soros said, I think yesterday, this week anyway, that Russia's invasion may have sparked a third world war. Henry Kissinger, also in his 90s, weighed in and this week and said, we should let Russia have Eastern Ukraine, end the war, and avoid further bloodshed in that way, kind of his realpolitik. What is your sense of where this is headed?
Well, I think they're both horribly wrong. I certainly hope they're horribly wrong in the case of nuclear war. The war had been going remarkably well for Ukraine. They had fended the Russian forces off without capturing a major city in the west. They had cornered the Russian forces back in the Donbass, and things looked like, gosh, these guys could actually win the war. Things have not been going as well over the last few weeks. And you've seen the president respond in kind by authorizing the deployment of a range of drones, anti-aircraft weaponry that really is designed to bolster Ukraine as Russia begins to grind away, making small but steady progress in the east. It would be a vast miscalculation and error to try to partition Ukraine after they have endured a brutal genocidal war and fought so bravely. It would make, frankly, Munich seem like a good, tough deal, referring to 1938, of course. The West, I think, has to support Ukraine in their fight for national sovereignty, for democracy. And if at some point Ukraine decides it is in their interests to make some kind of territorial concession to Russia, we should support that. But we should not be the one foisting that on the Ukrainians. Should we do that, we will only whet Putin's appetite. We will only encourage this sort of behavior. And the Chinese government, the PRC is clearly watching, clearly paying attention to how the West responds to this. They're a bit nervous, frankly, that the West has shown some spine. And they have their eyes, quite frankly, on Taiwan and other pickings, if you will, in the Asia-Pacific area. So what we do matters a lot. And we have achieved something which few thought was possible, say 6 months ago, and that is a degree of unity among the Western allies, a possible expansion even of NATO to include Finland and Sweden, and really a kind of resolve that we haven't seen since World War II. So I think to undercut all of that by pulling the rug out from under Ukraine would be a vast mistake. Listen, the president has been clear. He is not going to send American troops and not going to engage directly with Russia. That is a formula for a much wider potential nuclear confrontation. But by the same token, I think we have to recognize that refusing to take on Russia, refusing to stop Putin and disable his gains is itself dangerous and will provoke further aggression and further erosion of the international sort of scheme and rules of the road. So I think Biden was right to rise to the moment. I think the Europeans are going to have to continue to wean themselves from Russian fuel. They've done some of that this week with some notable exceptions, Hungary. I think we also have to understand this is not going to likely be resolved in a day or a week or a month. This is a long, drawn out process, and we have to show some resolve.
Speaking of Hungary, how are they able to say no to that, to say no to the EU and say we're going our own way on this? How do they have that power to do that?
Well, you know, the EU operates on consensus like NATO does. And Viktor Orban, the authoritarian leader of Hungary, has decided to play both sides, frankly. He wants to keep good relations with Putin. He's nervous about democratic independent governments. And so he has chosen to kind of straddle the line and prevent a perfect consensus on this issue. And that's the nature of dealing with the European Union. I think this issue stands out a bit because we haven't seen this to date. We've seen remarkable unanimity on a whole range of issues, but it's not easy to, corral all the cats, to herd the cats, and to keep everybody on perfectly the same page. So I think the administration's approach has been right, which is to try to let the EU put forth what they would be willing to do, and then accept that as consensus and keep moving forward and keep moving forward and keep adding additional burdens. And to the extent that we had hoped to really impair the Russian economy, we have. And Putin has, I think, eroded, 30 years of economic progress that Russia has made, and is consigning his people to a pariah status that is going to be very hard to recover from in the near term.
Okay, let's get to a couple of listener questions and switching topics. Kay asks, what can actually be done about assault weapons and gun control? I mean, you've seen the House proposal just, foundering in the Senate.
Yes.
Today, the latest proposal.
Well, this goes to the larger issue of a dysfunction in American democracy, where you can have an issue on which a supermajority of Americans agree should be done, and it goes nowhere year after year after year. And that's because of the Senate, and that's because of the filibuster. So there is a bipartisan group that is trying to come up with some kind of agreement on so-called red flag laws and background checks. I have gone down this road so many times. I tend to be pessimistic about their chances, although I certainly wish them well. But I think at this point, achieving any bipartisan consensus would be helpful, would be one step further. And I would say that following the Parkland shooting in Florida, you saw a major gun reform bill in Florida, which has become a pretty Republican state. And so it is possible, perhaps only at the state level, but nevertheless there, that personal experience, a tragedy, a horrible massacre, can really shake people's pre-existing views and put pressure on political leaders. And we'll see if that happens in Texas, and we'll see if other states take that up. The difficulty with a state-by-state solution, of course, is that guns come from everywhere. And I was talking to a former prosecutor from Alabama who remarks that it happens all the time, that crimes in New York City turn up with guns that were purchased in Alabama. And the same is true in many states. So we really do need a national consensus. But frankly, until we have a Democratic president, a Democratic House, a Democratic Senate, and some modification of the filibuster rule, we will not solve this problem.
We have all of those except for the filibuster.
Yes, exactly.
So do you think that this is something, because you don't have, well, but you don't have Manchin on board either.
Correct,
so.
correct. And I actually think this is something that Democrats running for Senate should raise in the campaign. If you get, for example, 52 Democratic senators, that would be one to replace Manchin and one to replace Sinema, not to replace them, but to make up for no votes. You actually could have some filibuster reform. Now, the Democrats are in danger of losing the House, so that might be for naught. But I think Democrats should not be shy about explaining to the American people that the reason why we have such gridlock, the reason why Congress doesn't move on things that have overwhelming popularity is because of this filibuster rule. And that contrary to Joe Manchin's protests, this is not, the cornerstone of democracy. It's become a vehicle for a tyranny of the minority. So I think the short run is not, frankly, all that bright. But I think Democrats, again, need to present this and run on this issue. And ultimately, we get the government we deserve and we vote for. And if the American people return a Democratic House and a Democratic Senate with a large enough margin to reform the filibuster, we'll have progress.
Although, as you say, most people are concerned about buying groceries and gas, and they're not really thinking about the filibuster.
Right. But I think that's exactly why Democrats have to explain it. And I think they are concerned about guns. I think parents, non-parents, teachers, non-teachers, this is very much in their mind. And I think the repetition of these events, particularly events that involve small children, has a huge effect on voters. So it's up to Democrats to explain the connection between voting Democratic and getting what they want, and to explain why it is we haven't solved this problem or even made progress on this problem.
Okay, let's get to another few questions. Let's see. E.A. Smith asks, how can citizens actively get involved in the effort to counter the anti-democratic tendencies of the Republicans?
Great question. I get this a lot from viewers, and the answer is there's a lot you can do. You can vote. You can encourage those you know to vote. You can volunteer on campaigns. You can give money to organizations that litigate on behalf of democratic principles. You can support candidates who do the same. You can volunteer as a poll worker, and this is critically important. The Republicans have a very organized effort to put election deniers and hyper partisans in these roles to make mischief at the polls. And so if you are concerned about the fair, clean operation of elections, volunteer to be a poll worker. You can, frankly, show up at your congressman or your senator's office You can write letters. Don't send a form email. Write something that's specific and personalized. You can write letters to editors. Those politicians do read those. You can give money. There are lots of ways in which you can make your voice heard. And I think the outpouring of participatory democracy that we saw following Trump's election, which I wrote about in my book, is the solution. Ultimately, you have to get people engaged. And if people sit back, throw up their hands, we're going to get a government and a country many of them don't like.
Gordon asks, the United States has had rank divisiveness in the past. Do you see us emerging from this dark period?
I'm sorry, I didn't quite hear that.
We have had rank divisiveness in the past. Do you see us emerging from this dark period?
Yeah, we have had divisions, and one of the reasons I read is that it gives me some optimism and political perspective. We've gone through a civil war. We went through 1968, where the cities of America were in flames. So we have come through this before, and there's a great book called Upswing, co-authored by Bob Putnam, who wrote a whole series of books, including Bowling Alone. And what he looks at is the transition from the Gilded Age of the late 19th century, which is very much like our era, very sort of polarized in terms of wealth, huge gaps in wealth, corruption very, rampant, and a loss of communal identity, communal responsibility. And that changed quite dramatically in a relatively short time in the progressive era, from 1900 to really the 1920s, 1930s. And that consensus that was formed during the progressive era carried through in large part through the 1960s. And he looks at, how did that happen? How did we get ourselves out of such a divisive, such a dark place, and come to a place in which, frankly, there was a lot more equality of opportunity. There were great civic projects that were undertaken, challenges met. And the answer he found was that it began in grassroots movements. It didn't come from elites. It didn't come from Washington, D.C. It came from the states, and it came from individuals, civic organizations. It came from writers who wrote about the problem, who inspired people. And all of that is still available to us. We have a lot more noise than we did in 1920 in the form of social media. And we have a lot more people who have kind of decided that reality doesn't matter. They live in their nice, comfortable world of conspiracy theories. But that leaves millions and millions of Americans who can do something, who can organize amongst themselves, who can run for office themselves, who can run for local office, which we have learned increasingly is very important, whether it's the school board, whether it's the election canvassing board, whether it's local city council. These are important parts of the American political system. And I think if we begin at the bottom, not at the top, there is a path forward. And I think there are times of national unity when we do come together. And, look at the consensus on Ukraine. We were talking about Ukraine a moment ago. This country agrees on very little, but there really has been a bipartisan consensus. Yes, there's a fringe group on the right that seems to be rooting for Russia, but you have a remarkably high percentage of Americans who are supportive of Ukraine and are willing to sacrifice. So I think when the situation presents itself, yes, we're capable of clambering our way through it. And, when we've exhausted all the other possibilities, we'll do the right thing. So I remain in the short term, somewhat pessimistic, in the long term, very optimistic.
Good. That is a great way to end. A good note to end on, I have to say. So
there we go.
Do you want to add anything else? It seemed like a
No, I just think,
Okay.
I'll just stress the importance of this election. I think there are a huge number of critical elections, and those include state lawmakers, those include governorships, those include secretaries of state who are vital to the electoral process. So people really have to engage. Now is no time to check out. And 2018, which was the first midterm, the only midterm of the Trump presidency, showed that Democrats can turn out in the midterms and can elect people who represent their values. So 2022 is quite an important time, and perhaps now we have some incentive to explain to people what they have at stake. So go vote, go volunteer, go give money.
Right, and vote in our local election in June.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Los Angeles has a pretty big one coming up.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you so much for coming and speaking with us. And
it's
sharing
been
your
my
views.
absolute pleasure. Thank you, Madeleine.
I'll see you soon. And hopefully we'll see you soon. Next week, stay tuned for a fascinating discussion with New York Times columnist David Leonhardt, Pulitzer Prize winner, with Larry Mantle. So that's next week at the same place at 5 o'clock. And I will see you soon too. Bye.